Greetings, friends around the world. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel. Are the Jews correct that the year that runs from sunset September 9th, 2018 till sunset September 29th, 2019 is the year 5779? Is that correct? What's that year supposed to be? The year 5779, they call it AM, which stands for Anno Mundi. And supposedly, that's the age of the world, based upon supposedly the Bible and their scholars. But if you go through the Bible and you look at certain things, you add up who begot who, when, and reigns of certain kings. And although there's some overlaps and stuff, and you got to consider that as well as some prophetic scriptures. But when you put it all together, and you get a number that's closer to like 5,990. So it's like off 200 years, maybe over 200 years from the Jewish explanation, or the Jewish date. Now I've heard various reasons why. One common reason is some rabbi accidentally made a mistake, and the mistake's been carried forward for there because of tradition. And another one is that the Jewish historian Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, made some comment about time and Seth, and that they started counting time from that time, and that's why it's off. But the problem with that explanation, by the way, is that that explanation would be closer to the year 4000 instead of 5,900 or 5,779. So that isn't actually what happened. There was a book written in 1997 by an Orthodox, Jewish Orthodox lawyer, actually, by the name of Michael First, and it's called Jewish History and Conflict, a study of major discrepancy between rabbinic and conventional chronology. And so he went into some reasons about that, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But in terms of conventional chronology, there's something that the Jews have called the Seder Olam. Okay, it's an ancient document. It's been reprinted. It's an ancient document. And I'd like to read some of what the Jewish Encyclopedia from over 100 years ago, a century ago, said about it. Seder Olam Rabbah. Earliest post-exilic chronicle preserved in the Hebrew language. In the Babylonian Talmud, this chronicle is several times referred to simply as the Seder Olam. And it is quoted as such by the more ancient biblical commentators, including Rashi. So what's this saying? What they're saying is, okay, in terms of how old the world is or whatever, in Hebrew, this is the book. This is the book that they use. Yet the Jewish Encyclopedia also includes, if you read their article, it says it's got information in it that's contrary to historical facts. So the Jewish Encyclopedia knows that this particular thing has problems. Again, that was written over 100 years ago. Now, I found something in 2018, and I'd like to read this from a Jewish scientist by the name of Saul Kulek. He said, the Hebrew calendar year 6,222 years from now marks the end of the age of the Messiah, but scientist Saul Kulek has calculated a different date, bringing us closer. So let's quote him precisely. It says, according to the Seder Olam Rabbah and our current Hebrew calendar, the destruction of the first temple took place in 442 BCE. This means our Seder Olam Rabbah and our current Hebrew calendar are out of sync with modern historical records concerning the destruction of the temple. It introduces a difference of 164 years in relation to the scholarly counting of past historical events. And basically, what the scientist claims is that, okay, the return of the Messiah is going to be sooner, or the coming of the Messiah, they don't think he's returning, is sooner. Because Jewish legend or writings from the Talmud, and even before, technically this is supposed to go back to the school of Elijah, the prophet, so way before the time of Jesus, basically originally said that the Messiah was supposed to come after 4,000 years. So if you go from the time Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden to the time of the Messiah, they said it would be about 4,000 years. But basically what Jewish writings say is, well, the Jews, they weren't so good. Since they weren't so good, the Messiah didn't come then. But he's going to come at the end of 6,000 years. So that's why when you look at their calculation, it says 5,779. That doesn't seem to fit. Well, it tells you got a long time till the Messiah is supposed to come. This scientist says, well, we've got to add at least another 164 years to that, so we're closer. But I believe it's off by over 200 years. Now, I'd like to read something from the Jewish Talmud. This is kind of like the Catholic equivalent of a living magisterium. It's kind of like a traditions from the Jews that were written in the early centuries AD. A Rabbi Yohanan said that the first temple stood for 410 years. Okay? Now, this is often repeated in Jewish literature. Okay? That's how long the temple stood. And I'm going to question, while I don't fully agree with that, that's what the Jews have said. But if that's the case, I want you to consider something from the Jewish Encyclopedia. They said Solomon was the third king of all Israel, and he reigned from 971 to 931 BC. Well, since the temple began in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, according to 1 Kings 6:1, and it took 7 years to complete, according to 1 Kings 6:37, if you take 410 years from 971 minus 4 years when he started and 7 years and he got it done, you come up with 550 BC. That's off over 100 years from the 442 year that some say the Seder Olam points to. Well, what does this prove? It proves that the Jewish numbers don't add up themselves. Ignoring the historical side, the Jewish numbers with themselves still don't agree. And there's a century right there. Now, I'd like to read an admission by a Jewish rabbi by the name of Simon Schwab related to some of this. So I'm going to read a fair amount. The gravity of this intellectual dilemma posed by such enormous discrepancies must not be underestimated. Unsuspecting students, including the pupils of our Yeshiva and Beth Jacob high schools, are faced with a puzzle that appears insoluble. How could it have been that our forebears had no knowledge of a period in history, otherwise widely known and amply documented, which lasts over a span over 165 years, and which was less than 600 years removed from the days of the sages who recorded our traditional chronology in the Seder Olam? Is it really possible to assume that some form of historical amnesia had been allowed to take possession of the collective memory of an entire people? This should be quite like assuming that some group of recognized historians of today would publish a textbook on medieval history, ignoring all the records of, say, the 13th and 14th centuries of the Common Era. Would not this seem inconceivable, even for those who undoubtedly do not possess the necessary enormous Kachaman to accept the world of our sages? This enormous discrepancy between sacred tradition and secular data would appear at first glance to frustrate any and all hope that it might be possible to compile a comparative chronology acceptable to Orthodox Jewry and secular historians alike. To faithful believers in the veracity of our most sacred literature, both biblical and rabbinic, there seems to be left out only the following two alternatives between which to choose. One, faithfully put our trust in the superior wisdom of our inspired teachers of the Torah who have arrived at the absolute truth, and consequently to reject categorically and absolutely the right of any secular scientist, even the most objective in this field, to contradict our convictions. In this case, it would mean that we would have to declare these 165 years, which our tradition has ignored, are in fact non-existent and have been conjectured by secular scientists out of the clear blue sky. Now, before I go further, understand what he's saying. What he's saying is, by the way, and this is a problem Jesus objected to with the Jews of his days, he's saying, okay, we've got the Bible, okay, that will accept it's sacred. He's also saying that these Torah writings are sacred. They're inspired by God, kind of like the Bible, and that's not the case. He's saying that, well, we have a problem because if you look at all records history, our people were off a lot, okay? And the fact is, they were off a lot. Now, I'd like to read something else, or mention something else. He wrote some other things about this, and basically he says that, he refers to the book of Ezra and the Second Temple, and when that was supposed to be done. He says, if you look at that, the Jewish chronology in the Seder Olam is wrong. Then he says, you look at the fact that there were 9 Persian kings beginning with Cyrus, you add up their numbers, also proves that the Jewish reckoning was wrong. So what does he say about that? Let me read this again from him. There seems to be left as yet unexplored, only one avenue of approach to the vexing problem confronting us. It should have been possible that our sages, for some unknown reason, had covered up a certain historic period and purposely eliminated and suppressed all the records and other material pertaining thereto. If so, what might have been their compelling reason for so unusual a procedure? Now later he reneged on this, saying they wanted a cover-up, but the reality is there was a cover-up, and what's the reason? He thinks perhaps some divine command or something to say something that wasn't true. That's certainly not the case. That is not the reason. I'd like to go to another source. This is an appendix in something called the Annals of the World. And according to this writing in this appendix, was written by F. Jones, says, furthermore, the shortening as perpetuated in the Seder Olam was deliberate. And let me read some more from those particular annals. Okay, he said it's deliberate. I agree, by the way, that I think it was deliberate. I don't think some rabbi accidentally made a mistake in the 2nd century and it just got reported. I think it was intentional, and I'll give some reasons why as we go further here. Indeed, it is manifestly apparent that the real reasons for the deliberate altering of their national chronology in the Seder Olam were, 1, to conceal the fact that the Daniel 9:25 prophecy clearly pointed to Jesus of Nazareth as its fulfillment, and therefore as the long-awaited Messiah, and 2, to make that 70 weeks of years prophecy point instead to Simon bar Kokhba. Rabbis in the century immediately following Christ Jesus had a tremendous problem with so direct a prophecy as Daniel 9:24-27. This chapter speaks of the Messiah's appearing 69 weeks, i.e. 69 sevens, or 483 years after the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild the temple. This 538 prophecy, Daniel 9:1, unmistakably points to the start of the ministry of Jesus in 29 AD. Such must either be acknowledged and this person accepted and completely erased from Jewish consciousness. The latter could have been accomplished if the 69 or 70 weeks could somehow be made to apply to the century after the life of Christ. Then it would be possible for the rabbis to point to another Messiah who, as circumcisions would have it, would be cut off 100 years after the crucifixion of our Lord. Well, I don't agree with all these details here because I just believe that Jesus' ministry probably started in 27 AD, but the time frame is relatively close here. And what they're saying here is that, look, this was deliberate on the part of various ones. And so what happened was, because they rejected Jesus, they had to figure out how to make Daniel 9 apply to something or somebody. Now remember before, I was reading, if you use a 442 BC date for the temple, according to Seder Olam, and there's different people commit different calculations for that, that's off by over a century. Well, remember, if Jesus' ministry began 27, let's say 27 AD, ran to around 31 AD, okay, well, add like a century to that. What do you get? Well, you get to the 2nd century, so around the year 127, 131 AD, right? Well, guess what? Something happened around this time. So let me go back to this appendix to the Annals of the World. Bar Kokhba had been declared the long-awaited Messiah by the foremost Jewish scholar of that day, the highly venerated Rabbi Akiva ben Joseph. In 130 AD, Emperor Hadrian of Rome declared his intention to raise a shrine to Jupiter on the site of the temple. And in 131, he issued a decree forbidding circumcision, as well as the public instruction in the Jewish law. Having preached peace all his life, the 90-year-old Akiva gave his blessing to the revolution by proclaiming Bar Kokhba was the star of Jacob and the scepter of Israel. That was a reference to Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. So understand, they didn't accept Jesus. So about 100 years after Jesus is killed and resurrected, you got a problem with the Romans. So a Jewish scholar, rabbi, says, okay, this is the guy. And he ended up getting this chronology changed to make it point to this. Now, continuing from back to the annals of the world here, appendix. In his 98th year, Akiva was eventually imprisoned and condemned to death by the Romans. Among the many accolades heaped upon Akiva, which have elevated him as a preeminent authority, was the acknowledging him as the father of the Mishnah. Such prominence gave great weight to the Messianic expectancy Akiva placed on Bar Kokhba. Akiva's students became some of the most prominent sages of the following generation. Among these was Hosea ben Halafta. Akiva's influence on Halafta is apparent from a statement made concerning his education. It was merely said that Rabbi Akiva had been his teacher. As his mentor, Akiva's regard for Bar Kokhba would have been thoroughly embedded in Hosea. The preceding overview explains why the Seder Olam is held in such veneration and why the Jews still use it for their national dating. Yet the fact remains it's a dishonest attempt to conceal the truth with regard to Daniel 24 to 27 prophecy. By removing years from the duration of the Persian Empire, Rabbi Halafta was able to make 483-year Daniel 9, 24 to 27 prophecy fall reasonably close to the years prior to 132 revolt, during which Bar Kokhba rose to prominence as Israel's military and economic leader. Then with Akiva proclaiming, "This is the King Messiah," followed by all the contemporary sages regarding him as the King Messiah, the Jewish populace united around this false hope. Now, when I was reading through this, I mentioned something called the Mishnah. This is also part of the Talmud and is considered part of sacred tradition according to some Jews. Of course, it wasn't sacred, and Akiva was wrong. Bar Kokhba was not the Messiah. These were lies. Now, interestingly, there's a prophecy about that. Amos 2:4 says, "Their lies led them astray, lies which their fathers followed." So, well, that's not from a Jewish translation, so I want to read this from two Jewish translations. "And their lies have caused them to err, after which their fathers did walk." That's from Jewish Publication Society. "Their lies caused them to fall into error and to live the way their ancestors did." That's from the Complete Jewish Bible. So because of errors in tradition, people have accepted nonsense which is not true. It is not the year 5779 running from September 9th, 2018 to September 29th, 2019. That's not the case. Now, I've read into this many other scholars. For example, there's many other Jewish scholars that have concluded this. I'm not going to read a list of all those scholars, but it's not just one or two. Okay, it's obvious that this is what happened. Now, the other thing that's obvious is this didn't happen until after the first century. Why do we know this? I'm going to read something from the Jewish historian Josephus. I've got actually a lot about this here, but basically what I'm going to do is just read something that Josephus wrote, which talks about Antiochus Epiphanes and all this stuff, and says, "This desolation came to pass according to the prophecy of Daniel, which was given 408 years before, for he declared the Macedonians would dissolve the worship." Well, according to Jewish sources, let me read one verbatim. "In summary, Josephus is working from a different chronology than the Seder Olam." Correct. Josephus had a different chronology, which may not have been perfect, but it proves that in the first century, they had a different dating than what happened in the second century. Now, there's one, according to one set of writers, they say that the date assigned to Seder Olam for the reign of Darius the Mede, they're pointing to it being 374, yet that's off by about 200 years. So what happened, because the Jews did not accept the prophecy in Daniel, and instead they accepted Bar Kokhba. Well, before we get to this, I want to actually read the prophecy in Daniel. There's one particular prophecy I want to go into. Very part of it, just a small part of it, Daniel 9:26, the first half. I'm going to read this from the New King James and then from the Complete Jewish Bible. "And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, this Messianic means Messiah. So from a Jewish translation and a Protestant translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, they say the Messiah is going to come at a particular time, and then the temple is going to be destroyed. Well, so look at the order. Messiah comes, then the temple is destroyed. Well, what happened? Jesus came, and about 40 years later, almost 40 years later, the temple was destroyed. Okay? That should have been obvious to anybody who would look at this stuff. Well, the Jews and their respected rabbis were wrong. They told people to go after this guy, Simon bar Kokhba, whose name they changed, by the way, to try to make it sound like he was a good person. Unlike Jesus, this Simon was militaristic. So the Jews got their militaristic king, right? Well, Cassio Dio claimed that 480,000 Jews were slaughtered and more died from resulting plagues and famines related to the Bar Kokhba result. This was deadly, dangerous to the Jews. And instead, they went the wrong route. They should have accepted Jesus, but instead they did not. As far as various other Jewish writings, they've got different reasons for why things happened. But later in the Talmud, after they were wrong about Bar Kokhba, they basically said that you're cursed if you calculate when the Messiah is going to come, or something along that line. Well, the reality is, there was a calculation that people could have made, the Jews could have made, and that calculation was using the book of Daniel, decrees in the book of Daniel, and even if people disagree by what precise year, plus or minus a couple of years or 5 years or whatever it is, this all pointed to the 1st century AD. Okay, it pointed to the time of Jesus. Didn't point to anybody else. Jesus is the only one who could possibly fit various prophecies for that particular time. And consider also that the temple was destroyed after the Messiah came. And that's what the book of Daniel said. So what year is it? Roughly 5,990 plus or minus. I'm not absolutely certain. You say, well, how come you're not absolutely certain? Because you look at the dates in the scriptures, somebody begat somebody and somebody begat somebody. It's not likely everybody was begotten all in the same calendar day of the year. How they counted years and birthdays is a little bit different in the past. And there's some historical questions on a couple of dates. But they're not questions that would be off over 200 years. Okay, they're questions that would be off a few years here or there, a decade or two, but not anywhere close to 200 years. Okay, Jesus came when he was supposed to come. The current year could not possibly be 5,779. The current year starting in September, running from September 9th through of 2018 through September 29th, 2019. Could not possibly be the year 5,779 that the Jews declare. The Jews and anyone else who's not sure about the dates, or particularly about Jesus being the Messiah, may want to read our free online booklet, Proof Jesus the Messiah, which has hundreds of scriptures from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that Jesus fulfilled according to the New Testament, as well as some predictions that Jesus made in the New Testament that were fulfilled outside the New Testament, as well as this goes into some of the stuff about some of the dates and that type of information. But what year is it? Well, we're not 100% certain precisely when it is, but we know it's not 5,779. And if the tradition of Elijah and some others are correct, and Jesus is going to come at the end of the 6,000 years, we are getting very close to that. We are getting closer to the time the return of Jesus Christ establishes the kingdom of God on the earth. Believe the Bible. Believe what the Word of God says. It said the Messiah was supposed to come. The temple was then be destroyed. That happened. Jesus was the Messiah, and it is not year 5,779, which I believe was that those years at 5778, whatever 580, 5780, whatever they say around this time period. It's not possible. I believe it was intentionally done. It was intentionally to mislead people because they didn't want to accept Jesus as the Messiah, but wanted a militaristic individual who was not the Messiah. Anyway, for more proof about who the Messiah was, you can read our free online booklet, available at www.ccog.org, Proof Jesus is the Messiah. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel.